off. So it's a very great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Martin Jacques. Martin, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in 1945 in Coventry. My father was working at Armstrong Siddeley, which was then basically an aircraft factory. I suppose he was in charge of the research library, and my mother she was a mathematician, and she worked in the stress department. That's how they met. And then afterwards she became a full-time mother, because my sister came along 2 years later after me, and then she became a full-time teacher because my father got the sack from Armstrong Siddeley because he was a member of the Communist Party, and under martial aid you were not allowed to employ members of the Communist Party in white-collar jobs.
Really? When you say under martial aid, you mean any company was not allowed to?
I would imagine, I don't know whether it was any company. I shouldn't think so.
This was a sensitive
It would have been,
company.
aircraft factory.
Yes, yeah, I see. Do you know anything further back about your grandparents?
Yeah, on my mother's side, my grandfather was an accountant, with one, and I think he started his training with one of the big firms, Thomson's or something like that then, and then he was chief accountant at Humbers, which later became part of the Roots Group and so on, and his wife was her maiden name was Sankey, Lillian Sankey, and there was a firm called Sankey's, so I assume she was probably linked to that. They were a West Midlands kind of commercial family, basically, I think, both sides were. And then on my dad's side, my paternal grandfather, he was the manager of a co-op store, and that was his last job, and he worked I think it was in Nuneaton, and his wife, a maiden name Jones, and she came from the South Wales valleys, and her father was, I can't remember what that union used to be, but there was a union that was sort of in colliery managers or something like that. It was a notch above the sort of National Union of Mine Workers, and so her father, that's where her father came from. I think she came from Unisable.
Returning to your parents, what was their character like? I mean, how do you think they shaped you as people? Strict, kind, ferocious?
I was close to both my parents. My mother was, she was quite unusual for the time. I remember in Coventry, because she was a maths graduate from the 1930s, and Rural Holloway, and she was she was extremely kind, thoughtful person, and very selfless person, selfless to a T, too selfless, and she was a very educated woman. She wasn't very articulate with words. Words were not her thing, but I suppose numbers were her thing, really. And then she became a teacher and so on, and because my dad had to retrain, he retrained as a teacher, and so he had to go off to London for a year. So my mother looked after us and so on. And then she was a primary school teacher, and then she went to a grammar school and so on. But my memory of my mum is also very shaped by her illness. She probably had a heart attack when she was about 39, and she had various, probably repeat ones. That it wasn't diagnosed until much later that was probably what had happened to her. So she was always. This affected her energy levels and so on. So that was sort of blighted her life. I remember her going to bed very early by my standards, 9 o'clock or something like that. I was very, very close to my mother. We sort of had a telepathic communication. My dad was they were both interested in politics, but my dad was very interested in politics and was very interested in history, and he never went to university, and he was very interested in the war, and he was always reading about the war, Second World War mainly, and
was he involved with it?
No, because he was at the aircraft factory. So if you were in the aircraft factory, that was.
It was all right to be a communist during the war in the aircraft.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the people in the factory were members then, because so many people joined around sort of 1943, which is when they joined. Because my mother joined then as well. I think probably most of the stress department joined. And they both stayed in the Communist Party, and that clearly affected me. I mean, they never. There was a lot of discussion at home, but political discussion, but not. There was never any expectation or pressure on me about my views, or it was quite. In that sense, it was quite laid back, but clearly it did affect me because when I got into my teens, I got involved in CND, and then I later joined the Communist Party and so on. And but they were, I suppose, they weren't doctrinaire people for their time, if you know what I mean. I mean, you could say, well, it was quite doctrinaire anyway then, but they weren't. So they gave. I think that what did they do? I think they contributed. I think from my mother, I got my sense of values and personal morality and what mattered in life, and appreciating other people and not putting yourself first. These are all very, very strong things I got from my mother. And I think from both of them, probably particularly my father, I got a passion, an interest in politics and history and so on. And then I think from my mother especially, I would have got an ability to think laterally and out of the box, and sort of think for yourself.
What is your earliest memory? Not sort of vague leaves over your pram sort of memory, but something concrete. Do you remember any specific?
Well, yeah, I got my first memory like that. I mean, I do have memories going back much, to. I remember being in the front garden, of a little semi-detached 1930s suburban place when I was, lying in the pram. I got a memory like that. But my first really scorching memory, I think, was my mum and dad having a fight.
Physical fight?
Yeah. And I imagine it was when my dad was retrained. It was the only time I ever saw this. I suppose that's, if I was going to be a regular occasion, I wouldn't have remembered this one because there would have been so many others. But I think I must have been, 3 or something, 3 or 4, and my sister would have been 2 years younger. And I suppose it was probably the time my dad was in London. He hated, I think, probably going off to retrain in London, and that there was a lot of tension and how we're going to, money was a problem and all that. So, because it didn't happen, you know, they had a relationship of its time, very powerful gender division of labour, but they were, you know, and they were inseparable. So.
What was your first school?
Well, my first school was Radford Primary School, which was in well, you'd call it now an inner city school. And the reason, well, actually there was another school I went to very briefly for probably a term first, called Fletchhampstead. The reason was because there was the family crisis was that my dad had to go to London, so and mum needed to work. Fortunately, her sister, they had the two of them, was a headmistress, just been appointed. So she could offer my mum, a job in the primary school. And so this is at Radford, which is why I went, because my sister was too young to go to school, and of course there were no nursery provisions really. So my sister had to hang around the school during the day. And so I was there I was at Radford Primary School from 5 to 11.
Were you, by that time, particularly interested in anything, either in the school or messing around in the hobbies or in the streets or doing anything? I mean, were you collecting things? Were you keen on games? What were you doing?
Well, that's a good question. Bringing up my son now, I think I had great expanses of time that he doesn't have to do. Probably not very much. I mean, my first, I was, I wasn't interested in reading. So I didn't start reading until I was 7. And the reason I didn't start reading, the reason I started reading was because around that time, coming from Coventry, I became an avid follower of motor racing. And I remember writing to Sterling Moss when he was the sort of hero figure of the time. Sort of, dear Sterling, I think you're a great run driver. I don't know what it said, but something like this, And lo and behold, he replied. So there started a long correspondence which went on until I gave it up in my very early teens. But I used to go, anyway, my mum and dad said, look, you're so keen on it and so on. And anyway, I wanted to read these motor racing magazines, so that's how I learned how to read. Then I had an interest. So unlike my son, who's completely different, he got an astonishing sort of fictional repertoire already, whereas I never had anything like that. And so they said, well, we'll take you to the British Grand Prix in 1954, and they bought me a paddock ticket, and I went to meet Sterling Moss, and that's what I used to do. And I loved, absolutely passionate about it. So if you ask me what was the biggest thing in my life, that was it. That was it. I liked sport. I liked playing football a lot, and but there wasn't much sport on offer in those days. It was basically football. We didn't play. I don't know what we did in the summer, but we didn't do football. We didn't do cricket on that primary school. I didn't have. I wasn't interested. I mean, I was too young really to be interested in politics and so on. I did that was it. I think that I can remember.
And then at 11, you did 11 plus, did you? Or,
yeah.
And then you went on. Where did you go to school?
I went to. There were two direct grammar schools in Coventry, and I went to King Henry VIII at the age of 11, and that was. I loved going to. I mean, this was a huge experience. In fact, I remember my dad saying to, Harry, my wife, before they both died, and Harry and Dad. Harry told me this. Dad saying that as soon as Martin went to the secondary school, to the grammar school, he came home and he disappeared upstairs to do his homework, and he never reappeared till he'd finished his homework, and that was always the way. And he told Harry that they never ever had to say to me to do my work, because it was always my priority. So it was I loved going to secondary school. I loved the work. I was good at lots of different subjects.
What were your best subjects?
My best subjects were, for a long time, my best subjects was maths. I was a maths person. But I was also good, at history and geography. I wasn't very good at languages. Well, I was good at Latin, but not French. That's the wrong way around, really. And I really enjoyed history and geography and so on. But maths was so I chose the science route. Actually, I remember when I first went to grammar school. I don't know how they selected. There was a lot of streams, 5-6 streams, and there were 30 in a stream. And I remember they sorted them out in the playground, and the first class, and I thought the second class, I wasn't in that one. The third class, I was in the fourth stream. And I remember going back and I thought, why am I in the fourth stream? I haven't done anything yet. And I told my parents. They didn't say anything. But I'm quite a tough person, really, and so I thought this has got to be a big mistake. So by the end of that first year, I got promoted into I became one of the top kids in the school always. But and I was always, I was in when there was. But I say that because I remember personally that had a motivating effect on me. Actually, then I did. It was very early streaming for A level and so on. I did double maths and physics at A level.
Did you?
Yeah.
Gosh.
But during the course of my teens, I changed a lot. Well, everyone changed a lot, but I became political. I became I became aware of the world, of society, of all those sorts of questions. I began to define myself as left wing, and this began to eat into my interest in maths, really, I think. And so when I finished my time at after my A levels, I decided to, I didn't want to do maths at university, so I decided to stay on at school for an extra year and do history and economics, and which is what I did. But there was very little teaching available, because I could, by the time you're 18 you can select. So I decided, I roughly organised my syllabus myself and what papers I was going to do. I had some teaching in one of the two economics papers, but otherwise the other one I did myself, and both history papers I did myself. And I did. It was a brilliant year. I loved it. I loved it far more than my maths by then, even though I used to love maths earlier on. And so I went to university. I got a place at Cambridge, but I decided I didn't want to go to Cambridge because I wasn't sure I could cope with Cambridge.
Did you come for an interview or anything?
Yeah, I came for an corpus, and but I didn't want to. I decided I didn't want to because I had very little exposure. I came from where we lived. We lived in a sort of we lived in Coventry, which was a very, very kind of proletarian city dominated by large factories with the culture that went with it. It's not a very it's not an interesting city. It wasn't an interesting city beyond that. There's no real middle class worth mentioning then in Coventry. So it was quite a Philistine environment. There was later one theatre, the Belgrade Theatre, and so my range of contacts was very limited, I would say. And so coming to somewhere like Cambridge, for the interview and so on, I didn't feel comfortable here, and I'd got no exposure to private school. I mean, direct grammar school was, not quite 100% 11 plus, but the great majority. So I didn't, I'd been up to Manchester for an interview, and I quite fancied living I'd never been to a big industrial northern city, and I liked Manchester, so I thought, okay, I'll go to Manchester. So that's what I did.
To read history in English?
No, I went to read economics initially. That was what, yeah.
Actually, there's one question I always like to ask about this school, secondary school. Were there any teachers who particularly inspired you? Sometimes there's one or two teachers who people remember. If there wasn't, it doesn't matter. But
there was no teacher that I have memories of lots of teachers. There was no teacher that really was,
changed your life.
No. There was a teacher that I admired, but there was no teacher that I can say this is where something started.
Yeah. Okay. Manchester, how was that? Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, I had a great time in Manchester. I did enjoy the city very, very much. I found that very interesting. This was 1964. I really sort of began to become what I was for quite a long time there, I suppose. One, I was very academically committed, and also I was hugely politically committed. I became extremely active politically, as I was till I left Cambridge, and I learnt a lot through it, and I learnt a lot of skills through it, and it was a very, very interesting period to be a student, because it was 64 to 66 was not so interesting, but from after that it was exceptional. It was an exceptional period, I think.
You say you were politically active. I mean, in what way? Were you in the student union, or were you a member of the party by then, or not?
Yeah, I joined. Basically, I joined. I'd briefly been in the YCL, Young Commoners in Coventry, but I didn't get very involved in it because I was, studying and so on. But when I went to university, I joined the Communist Party, and I was also very active in the student union. So I became a member of the student council and so on. And one of my conflicts in my mind was, am I going to? There was pressure for me to stand for president of the union, which is a relatively big job for that age when you're in a university like Manchester. But I never did, because it really the two occasions when I were third year, I didn't want to do that, and I stayed on for a year, which was a mistake, and I could have done it then. But I didn't. I always held back, and I think I was right. There was one year I definitely could have got it, but I don't know about the other. You never know with big elections and so on. A lot of people voting. And then I was very active in the Communist Party and in the left, and it began to become, as time went by, more and more interesting, because Vietnam and apartheid and lots of things. So I burned the candle at both ends in the sense of my politics and my academic life. Manchester was. What happened was I started in economics, and then I drifted sort of into economic history. Really, that's how my progress took place. And the third year, I did my sort of my core specialist area was the interwar period. And then I remember an incident, which was that I was very active in the student movement. I was very well known. I was in the national newspapers. There was something called the Radical RSA, Radical Student Alliance, formed, And I was one of, the revolting students kind of thing. And I remember this guy phoned me up from the Daily Telegraph, and I can't remember what month it was. It was probably about January or February or something. Phoned me up, was on the call box, and he said, people say that all you revolting students, you militant students, you don't do any work. And actually, he said, in my experience, this isn't true. That the activist students, not all of them, but a fair number, are very good students. So I said, yeah, I think that's right. He said to me, well, what about you? So I said, well, I'd like to think I'm a very good student. I do one of my exams. And he said, what are you going to get in your degree? So I said to him, well, I'm going to get a first. So I thought to myself afterwards, when it was in the newspaper, I said, well, I have to actually get a first now. I can't not get one. So I remember cutting myself adrift from the university in I don't know, March. I pulled out of all my political activities because I knew I hadn't done enough work. Because if you're doing it like that, you don't do enough work. And organised my, a monastic regime based partly in Manchester and partly in Coventry. But I did get my first then.
You did? I was just wondering.
There weren't many firsts those days. I remember there were 200, it's in the Faculty of Economics, and there were only 4 firsts for 250 students. I mean, it was...
No, it's at least 10%. So
yeah.
Just thinking, I was going to ask about your parents too, as well as you. I mean, post-1956, this was a big trauma for the British and other members of the Communist Party after Hungary. Did this affect you onwards? I mean, and I'm not sure when the revelations about Stalin started to, become really serious. But were there internal doubts or divisions?
For me, I was too young.
Too young.
I mean, I was 56. I must have just turned 11. It was in the autumn, wasn't it?
So you were too young actually to even think about Hungary in 1956, but surely that had a sort of knock-on effect, and there were a number of people who left the party at that point, and later on news was coming out about what was inside the Soviet Union. Did that affect discussions at all? Or?
At home, because that's where it would be.
Yes.
It would only be at home. What I do remember is I remember the news. I remember seeing the news. I remember seeing bodies in the streets of Budapest. I remember asking my dad, what's it all about? I can't remember what he said. And then I can't remember, so that's all I can really remember. Subsequent to that, I remember the Khrushchev speech vaguely. But it wouldn't make much. And the Stalin. I mean, of course, if I'd have been a bit older, it would have made a huge impact. And I remember a bit that we see a bit later. Then there was some kind of speech given by Togliatti, who was then the general secretary of the Italian Communist Party, which was asking some much bigger questions about what was going on. And I remember my dad was very interested in that. And he showed me it. I can't remember I don't think I read it, but he showed me this is very interesting and so on. So but I can't exhume anything else from my memory. It is an interesting question because, by the time I went to university, I think that, when I really became, started intellectually being involved in a different way on these sorts of things, 56 was a strange blank for me, and it was bizarre because it had been so defining for so many intellectuals. Loads had left the Communist Party, and those that stayed had agonised over whether they should stay, and there were others that sort of who dismissed it all, I suppose. But the great defining moment for me was 1968. This was the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So my 56, because of my age, was 1968.
Okay, well, we'll come to that in a second. You said that, we've come to the end of your undergraduate degree. Though I wondered whether you said the two things you did were politics and work. I mean, were there other things? I mean, were you interested in music or acting or sport or anything?
I was interested in. I used to. I wasn't. I was never in any of the university teams, but I was keen on. I did some football. I played a lot of tennis. I became good at tennis in my secondary school, and represented the school, and we won the Coventry Championship and that kind of thing. But and I carried on, but I didn't get intensively involved in sport. I played it recreationally. And I used to go to the theatre, and I went to the Halle Orchestra from time to time. I think it was, he used to play in the Lesser Free Trade Hall then, and I remember seeing Oh What a Lovely War with Joan Littlewood. I used to go, and I went to the cinema and so on. I mean, I don't think I was hyperactive, but I was certainly, it was part of my life.
Meanwhile, down on Merseyside, something was happening.
Well, of course, thank you for the prompt. I would say, as a boy, as a teenager, I was a bit behind the curve.
So Elvis Presley passed you by? A bit.
Elvis Presley passed me by mainly, but not my sister. 2 years younger, but more advanced on these things. And but generally, I didn't get it. I wasn't particularly. I was probably a bit behind the curve on girls at that time when I was, sort of in my mid-teens, and clothes didn't interest me very much at that stage, but did later. So, but when the Beatles arrived, by then I was interested in pop music. I was interested before the Beatles, but the Beatles had made popular culture, popular music, Merseyside, Manchester was very interesting, made a big impact on me. And you couldn't, Manchester University was a very big centre for lots of groups. So and the guy that ran the social side of things then was Chris Wright, who later was the big entrepreneur behind Chrysalis and so on. So that was part of breathing the air, really.
The other thing which you may have been behind the curve or advanced of the curve, which often happens in late teenage and the teenage period, is religion. Some people with certain schools go through confirmation, and you didn't mention whether in theory, if your parents were communists and religion is out, has this been the case with you as well?
That's why I didn't mention it. My parents were they were atheists. So I don't think they never shoved anything down. I don't remember either me ever shoving anything down my throat. So I used to always go to assembly, and I used to sing the hymns and say the prayers and so on. But I never, except for I virtually never went to church. It wasn't just. I regret it in some ways, looking back on it, because religion, it's not just about belief; it's about custom and ritual and song very important, and so I think if I'd had more exposure to that, I would have understood it better. But I would say that intellectually, subsequently, because I was never engaged with it in that kind of way, I tended to not intellectually think about it or engage with it in that sense either, and that was my loss, I think. I mean, I would think it was my loss, and and when Harry died and I couldn't really cope with the situation at all, I knew that if I'd been religious, that would have been something that maybe it would have helped me, but I wasn't. I didn't become so.
You said after the university you wasted a year. What were you doing? I mean, you just...
Well, I did a master's, and the thing was that I think that the sheer effort, in the third year of doing all that politics and then pulling out and then throwing myself into this tremendous kind of surge of work, and I didn't really think, what am I going to do next year, where am I going to go, and so on. So the thinking for that came instead of coming in my third year, it came when I was doing my master's. And so I did a thesis. I did quite an interesting subject, actually. I did the nature and role of state intervention in Britain between something like it was a big thing. I wrote 80,000 words in a year, between 1900 and 1945, something. I got 39, something like that. It was a very interesting subject, but it was based on secondary sources, and then I decided I was fed up with Manchester by then, and I knew I'd made a mistake, and I was a year out, if you know what I mean, and so I decided. There was someone, my girlfriend then, her tutor had been at Cambridge for a PhD, and he said, "Why don't you go to Cambridge?" So I did.
Were there any teachers at Manchester lecturers or anyone who... Manchester had a great tradition of economic history and Ashton and so on, and also of economics in the late 19th, early 20th century. Were there any teachers by that time who were outstanding? You loved their lectures, or they taught you?
It's an obvious question. I mean, I used to go to, of course I went to my own lectures, I used to go occasionally to other lectures and so on. I can't think of anyone who, there were lectures I quite liked, lectures that I liked, but that's not really the question, I don't think. Was there anyone that really inspired me? I don't think there was. I mean, you're right. There's a strong historical tradition. There was a strong economic history tradition. This was Challoner and Henderson.
That's right.
Challoner was my tutor in my third year, and of course he was. By then, I was aware of the debates and Hobsbawm and the standard of living question in the first half of the 19th century, and of course Challoner was very much defined himself on the right. But Bill, he loved me, absolutely loved me, and we got on great. I mean, he wasn't intellectually a very inspiring person, but he was a very nice man, and so we got on great, and he'd been teaching this interwar thing for, I don't know, 18 years, and he said to me, he was always Jacques, he said, "Jacques, you're the first I've had in all the years I've been teaching this subject," but I can't say what you're asking me is more than that. You're saying, did he inspire you? No, I don't think I had any lecturers in that period that inspired me. I mean, I went through school, and you made me think about this. I went through school and my undergraduate life without really being
having a hero.
Yeah, exactly. That. I mean, I did have people that I really read, but they tended to be, I read a lot of Hobsbawm, but that I didn't know him, and he was just he was a name and articles and his early books.
Okay, well, I hope it all changes when you come to Cambridge. Your sense that you would be out of place in Cambridge as an undergraduate, what did you feel when you came as a graduate? How did it go?
Well, the first term was...
you came to King's College, Cambridge. Yeah.
And I suppose I came to King's because, left-wing tradition and all that.
Yeah.
I made a mistake, I think, when I came because... I had an option to live in, and I decided not to because I thought, well, I don't want to live in a hall of residence. Of course, it's not a hall of residence, so I should have lived in, but I didn't. The first year was not easy because I think that a mistake I made in my higher education was never to take a break.
You mean a gap year?
A year off, of some kind. I mean, you didn't take gap years then, and in the way they become a sort of industry, and I think I was exhausted, because I'd really been doing two jobs. I'd been doing my academic life and I'd been doing my political life, and I wanted to have I needed to think of things from a different angle. I needed to be less on a treadmill. Another factor that increased this problem was that when my girlfriend in Manchester became my wife at the end of my first year at university, and so she was in Manchester still, so that was
difficult.
There was a lot of travelling. So it took the first term. I didn't really settle, and I resented what seemed to me to be a ridiculous Cambridge mentality, this idea that this was the centre of the world. Cambridge people think Cambridge is some kind of epicentre, and I said, well, how can you think that? I've come from Manchester, a big industrial city. No. But as the time went by, I really, really enjoyed myself here. This was what I never got at Manchester. And what I really got was, I did my PhD, I got my PhD, it was a good PhD, etc. But what I really got from Cambridge was the stimulation of lots of very bright people and conversations that I'd never had before, or subjects that were explored that I thought I knew that were explored in quite new ways. And so this was very, very good for me. And of course I was, by then the left had exploded, because it was 1968, and so this started not in 68, it actually all started in 67. This very, very new kind of atmosphere, and this was intellectually and politically very stimulating and so on, and I was hugely bound up with all that. The left was a very stimulating place during this period. I don't mean that it was right, but it was a very stimulating atmosphere, and I met lots of very, very interesting and very intelligent people from whom I learnt a lot. And I threw myself into that. And what I got from Cambridge was not so much my PhD. What I got was this tremendous intellectual stimulation. This was when I think I was really... This period from around about 67, before I left Manchester, from about 67 to 71 when I left Cambridge, was sort of my formation in a way.
If you were here in 68, was Provost Leach provost by then?
Yeah.
What did you have any encounters?
No, I didn't have any encounter. I didn't sit in his office or anything like that.
Did you know him at all? Or?
No, not really. No, I didn't. I knew who did I know then? I knew, the senior tutor then was Ken Polak.
Oh yes.
And the graduate tutor was Bob Young.
Yes, well, he was quite a left-wing character.
Yeah, he was.
wasn't he?
Yeah, and then Geoffrey Lloyd followed Ken Polak as senior tutor.
Yeah.
I got on very well with Geoffrey Lloyd.
Did you?
Yeah.
He's a very nice man.
Yeah, I really. In fact, he was one of the people when I was leaving Cambridge. King's. We weren't that close, but I thought I'll miss. I was going to miss him. I really liked him very much and enjoyed him. And then of course Bob Rowthorne. I became very good friends with Bob Rowthorne in that period. Probably my closest friend.
Was he was doing a PhD or was
no, he was a fellow, but he never did a PhD.
Oh, he was a fellow by then.
Yeah, and he was a lecturer in economics.
Was Keith Hopkins here then or not?
Doesn't ring a bell.
No, he'd gone to the LSE by then.
But I mean, there was a lot of people I knew well, academically as well. Paul Ginsburg, who was Italian history, a historian. Yeah.
Yes.
And of course Brian Pollitt was here. I knew him quite well. He was working on Cuba then, and a lot. I mean, John Dunn, Martin Bernal.
Martin, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think your interest in China was that anything to do with Martin?
Nothing at all.
No.
Because I did actually, because my first academic job was in Bristol after Cambridge, and I did invite Martin down actually, but I didn't know him hardly at all. But he came down and I arranged two talks, one on he did one on Vietnam and one on China. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. But to be honest with you, Alan, it was like a kind of capsule because it didn't inform what I was interested in beyond being fascinated by the talk. What I should say to you is that my big political change came in 1967-68. I rose very rapidly to a high position in the Communist Party in that period. I became a member of its executive committee, the youngest member, probably youngest ever or something. About 22 or something like that. And I was much too young for that situation, and I felt very uncomfortable there and out of place. But I stayed the course. And I felt, and it coincided that having that position with getting that position in late 67 with this huge political change, which really, as a university person, started in the autumn of 67 into 68. And it was when I basically rethought lots of things that I had thought previously. It was when I came into contact with Gramsci's ideas, which was, insofar as any Marxist thinker shaped me, it was Gramsci, not Marx, not certainly not Lenin, and so on. And to this day, I have this day. I mean, if there was anyone that shaped Marxism today, in broad terms, it would be probably that some of his ideas, the notion of hegemony and so on. And I watched with great interest from the end of 1967, beginning of 1968, what was happening in Czechoslovakia. The action program was published in January. I became very strong advocate of what was happening in Czechoslovakia. I went to Prague in August. Was it late July, early August 1968? And when the Soviet tanks invaded Czechoslovakia, well, it was for me. Well, I think I don't know why I stayed in the Communist Party. I mean, I think that I stayed in the Communist Party because the Communist Party at that point opposed, the British Communist Party opposed the intervention in Czechoslovakia. If it hadn't, it would have been curtains. And but I felt that even though they opposed it on the weakest grounds, and so various factors unleashed a sort of me on a very independent-minded trajectory. This is when I sort of really grew up, if you like, and I became, I could say, well, these now, whatever ideas, these were really my ideas now. I wasn't inheriting them. They were, I was working out my position on my view, my world view of some kind in that period. And Cambridge was a very important crucible for that as well.
And you mentioned Vietnam, and I went on the big march.
The march,
yes,
with the violence.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
But that must have been about 71, because I wasn't here till 71.
Oh, okay. There was a big violent one in 1968 in March.
Oh, maybe, yes, I was at the LSE then. Maybe I went from the LSE. But how did Vietnam play into all your...
Vietnam was... I think that I was probably, that Vietnam was easily the most important issue around then, and I think it was the biggest single issue that radicalized students, apart from much broader, cultural contexts, which were clearly very much at work, because I think looking back on that period now, the libertarian rather than the left trend was stronger. And that wasn't a function so much of Vietnam, so there were other coordinates. But the feeling on Vietnam was so strong, and when I was at Manchester in sort of 67, 68, it seemed as if there was a march every weekend, and or something going on, and then you go down to London, and then we organised a big teach-in. I can't remember that where I can't remember. But my memory of Vietnam was extraordinary. I shared the very strong feelings that students had in that period, and was very active on it.
Has it continued to shape your attitude to America at all?
I think that what probably Vietnam did was, if you're on the left, was made me, antipathetic to the United States, and fed a certain kind of anti-Americanism, I think. And because I had never, I hadn't been to the States then, I think, I never. Some students, some people went to the States, but I didn't, and I wish I had actually, but I didn't, and so.
You've been there subsequently?
Many times, yeah. Especially in the last 2 or 3 years, and I really enjoy going to the States now. Really enjoy it.
What is your feeling about its current trajectory, apart from enjoying it?
Well, when I say I really enjoy going, I really enjoy appreciating it, getting to understand it, like Americans. Which isn't the same as liking America, and I think it's going to be the outlook for America is going to be extremely difficult, and I think that America is now in decline, and but Americans by and large, although they're now debating it, discussing it in a way that's never been discussed before, they're just at the beginning of this process.
Is this relative decline or absolute decline?
Well, it's relative decline. I mean, I think this is going to be a very, very painful period for America, and I don't know how it's going to respond to this, and what one can imagine it turning in various directions, or maybe all of them actually at some point. It's probably most likely, and I think they're going to find this very, very difficult. I mean, as Britain found it very difficult. I mean, my life has been bounded by British decline, and I think we found it very, very difficult, and we still, in some ways, can't bear it.
Okay, well, let's come back to. Well, you left Cambridge. You went to teach in Bristol.
Yeah.
In economic
history. Yeah.
Economic history.
Yeah.
For how long did you go there?
I was there for 6 years, and I mean, when I went to Bristol, I found after Cambridge, I found Bristol very sleepy and boring. I've always been a very sort of a proactive kind of person, so I tried to do something about it in my own way. I mean, one of my skills has always been, which I don't use anymore, but I was quite inventive person, socially inventive person. So, for example, the campaign here, which must have been around the time you arrived, for after the Garden House,
yes,
and the formation of the Cambridge Students' Union. I mean, I was the guy that masterminded all that sort of thing, and I really took. I mean, I don't remember the big unemployment marches, the People's March for Jobs, but that was my. So I loved doing that, and I did that obviously with Marxism today and so on later. So I really I enjoyed thinking afresh, how to do things, how to. I got a great deal of stimulation from and.
So you tried to shake up Bristol. Did you succeed?
Oh no, I didn't. Old slave city that is. I think that. Yeah, we had. I was an academic, so I was in a different situation anyway. And so I remember, I got a left staff group going, and there was a sort of what we call critical seminar, which was for students and staff, and so there were various things I did, but. And I was, writing and so on, but academically. But I think that I think in my mind I was, I had somewhere in my mind decided I wasn't going to stay as an academic. Whether I'd actually consciously reached that decision. At what point I reached it, but I think that I was not, or put it in another way, I was not committed to being an academic. That's probably more honest, actually, thinking about it. That's probably where I was.
Were you already involved in journalism and starting sort of leftish journals and things by that time?
No, nothing, absolutely nothing. In Cambridge, one of the things I wasn't involved with, for example, was the shilling paper. In Manchester, I was never involved with the student newspaper. I had no interest whatsoever in journalism, none whatsoever. But I was interested in, that here I was very active and by now very prominent in the Communist Party with, a serious political following, which was sort of Euro-communism, if you like. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And I was by now a sort of power broker, if you like. I mean, these are all gross oversimplifications. And I got, they were rewriting the program, and I became the key figure in the rewriting of the program. There was an argument. The thing was so divided, so fractious. And then I got asked, would I edit Marxism today?
Would you edit it? Yeah. It was already going.
Yeah. It was started in 1957.
Oh, right.
After the 20th Congress in Hungary. And I'd never thought of doing something like that in my life. It didn't appeal to me. What appealed to me was that it was a potentially reformable organisation which could have a different path, informed by my kind of Gramscian thoughts and so on. That's how I saw it. So after much agonising, I accepted. I mean, one of the reasons for agonising, I felt, if I get out of academia now, which people didn't do that but in 1977, I thought, if I get out of it now, then I'll never get back into it or whatever. So I felt I was burning my boats. And also I was taking a colossal drop in salary. I was going to something like 25% of what I'd been earning or something. It was
a big risk.
It felt like it.